This week, the FDA approved an mRNA flu vaccine, and the Senate voted to hold Dr. Anthony Fauci in contempt. These might sound like two stories, but they're part of one larger, bigger story. Our tools have never been better. We licensed an mRNA vaccine against a third pathogen. A formal paper was published showing that artificial intelligence can engineer bacteriophages to combat bacteria we might otherwise not be able to treat. And the most ambitious real-time research effort in the history of filovirus outbreaks is running right now in the DRC. Our institutions have never been weaker. We are about to be told officially that the United States no longer has measles elimination. The Ebola outbreak is growing about 5 times faster than any Ebola outbreak on record. And the country is putting one of the most accomplished infectious disease physicians of his generation through a contempt of Congress referral. Everything I'm going to talk about today kind of sits in that gap between what we can do and what we let ourselves do. I'm first going to talk about Ebola in the DRC. This is the fastest growing Ebola outbreak on record, and at the same time, it's the most ambitious research response ever mounted. Same place, same time. 2 different things going on there. So now we're hitting close to 4,000 cases, over 1,600 deaths, about 75 new cases being added per day. This momentum has not slowed. Science reported that this actual outbreak, even though it was notified in May, probably had been transmitting since January, and maybe 500 cases had accrued. This is a very interesting story, how they uncovered this, having to do with anthropologists working through clinic records, WhatsApp messages, and this really concretizes the fact that anthropologists need to be a core response infrastructure when it comes to these types of outbreaks, because they uncover a lot of things. They are able to discover things that you don't usually with just epidemiologists and physicians, for example. The underlying theme of this outbreak is contact tracing is not working. The vast majority of diagnosed cases are not arising from known contacts. That means that there's a whole shadow outbreak occurring. That means that there's no situational awareness. This isn't a resource failure. This is just basically inability to do basic public health work there because of the population and the logistical difficulties that there are. There is a boat going down the Congo River that was carrying a couple hundred passengers moving toward the capital, Kinshasa. There was a death on board with somebody who had Ebola-like symptoms. The passengers are now under observation. There is a lot of concern about introduction of the virus into the capital. Hopefully it won't turn out to be that way, but that's something that's also conditioning the response. The US continues to be the largest donor, and it's doubling its contribution. 180 Ebola treatment units, 300 tons of equipment, all coming with US support. But at the same time, that sits alongside travel bans, quarantines, the ridiculous Kenya facility, which don't help at all. What we're seeing is this outbreak is leading to cascading problems. For example, maternal deaths in affected areas are running around 6 per week, which is double the baseline because women are foregoing prenatal care because of the disruption of the Ebola outbreak. But there is one major bright spot, and I think it's a real bright spot. The fact is that there are multiple clinical trials going on. CEPI has built a database of DRC sites suitable for phase 1 trials. Moderna CEPI-funded mRNA Bundibugyo vaccine entering phase 1 clinical trials in Canada in 80 healthy adults. Monoclonals and antivirals are in trials. Preclinical data looks good. It's not the same as clinical data, but I think the signal is really there, and you're seeing expanded use of both antivirals and vaccines. Lancet Infectious Diseases reported on CME Bunia, which was the healthcare facility where the first American was infected, Dr. Peter Stafford. If you remember, he was treated in Berlin. One of the interesting things there, and this has to go back to the vaccine, is that half of the staff at that facility had prior Ebola Zaire vaccination and appeared anecdotally to have lower mortality. So the question is there cross-protection with the Zaire vaccine and the Bundibugyo virus? And I think that this is a real live hypothesis, and they're trying to now make it available in expanded use. And there are CEPI-funded ring vaccination trials that are going to start with this Merck Ebola vaccine. So I think this is going to be really critical, and it dovetails with the remdesivir randomized controlled trial, as well as remdesivir use in the compassionate use format in order to get countermeasures on board. I think this really shows that real-time research can happen, and it also shows the urgency relating to a need to have something to staunch the spread of Ebola. But overall, control is going to depend on communities owning the response. This has to have acceptance from the general community there for safe burial practices, to go to Ebola treatment units, to participate in contact tracing, to participate in clinical trials. None of this external stuff is going to stop the outbreak. It really needs to have the community own the response, and that's where, as I said earlier, anthropologists can play a major role. Now I'm going to move to measles and U.S. elimination status. PAHO is about to rule in a couple of months, but the ruling is not going to change the underlying fact. We do not have the ability to control measles in the United States currently. In the past week, about 100 cases were added, record pace, majority from Pennsylvania, which is my home state, over 200 cases. In Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, which is in the central part of the state, is now the 7th largest county outbreak in the country. And obviously, we have low coverage pockets with insular communities that live there that have traditionally had lower vaccination rates, but it is spilling into other surrounding areas. The other point I want to make about measles is don't just look at aggregate numbers in a given county, in a given state, even in a given school district. And I keep coming back to what's going on in my hometown of Pittsburgh, where certain elementary school districts like Concord, for example, 74% coverage of MMR. The virus will find those 26% when it gets to those schools. So school level data is really what's important because that's where these transmission events are going to occur. And these don't cost nothing. New Mexico's outbreak response cost $5.4 million, $2.1 million on vaccination, $3.2 million on public health investigation, mostly taxpayer borne. To have measles is not fiscally responsible. And that's what people are choosing to do, is to waste taxpayer money on these outbreaks. Back to the decision on elimination. So the PAHO decision hinges on genomic evidence of continuous transmission for the past 12 months, meaning the same strains. All of this whole genomic sequencing that they're going to do, that's likely going to show that there's been a continuous outbreak. Even for some reason, if it doesn't, just remember the United States no longer has the capacity to control measles. They gave that capacity away voluntarily. And we are watching endemicity take hold in real time. Meanwhile, another MMR and autism study published this week, 2.5 million children followed to age 8, no increased risk. And at the same time, an executive order is being issued by the president to fund more research on the same question. Again, squandering taxpayer money, diverting money from understanding the real etiologies of autism. RFK Jr. has recently endorsed the MMR. It's a genuine reversal on paper. I don't believe it. And it arrived inside an interview that was full of disinformation on everything from other vaccines to Lyme disease. I don't think that RFK Jr. actually wants people to get the MMR vaccine or that he believes in the MMR vaccine. There is an outbreak in Delaware, and what we're seeing there in Delaware is that MMR uptake is rising at mobile clinics as the outbreak got closer. Some people are starting, I guess, will move when the threat becomes imminent. That's obviously not proactive, that's reactive. There's still not enough of them doing that to staunch these outbreaks of measles that are going on. I want to now talk a little bit about the FDA approval of Moderna's mRNA flu vaccine. So this is the third pathogen for which mRNA vaccines have been approved. And this was licensed despite the federal government initially walking away from the technology and walking away from this particular vaccine candidate. We have now mRNA vaccines against influenza, COVID, and RSV in the United States. Moderna says that they'll be able to have this flu vaccine supply in a few weeks. The open question really is what's going to happen with the non-functional ACIP? Are they going to recommend it? And what will that mean for insurance coverage? The big advantage of mRNA flu vaccines is the fact that most of our flu vaccines are wedded to chicken eggs. And even the ones that aren't based in chicken eggs, like Flucelvax and Flublok, they're still wedded to that timetable. And that timetable requires a long lead time in order to pick strains that are going to appear in our seasonal flu vaccine. An mRNA vaccine platform can break that schedule. Moderna is saying they can take that 6-month lead time down to 2 to 3 months. Hopefully, they'll also bring along Flucelvax and Flublok with it, but that makes it much easier to avoid vaccine mismatches. This vaccine also seems to have higher efficacy. If you look at 2024 to 2025, looking at flu vaccine efficacy against needing a doctor or an emergency department visit, and those over 65, it was just 4%. That's really negligible. Obviously, the vaccine works better at prevention of severe disease, hospitalization, and death, but that number is why we need game-changing flu vaccines, which will increase the value of the flu vaccine to the individual and diminish the disruption that annual flu seasons have on day-to-day life. When you look at this vaccine, the efficacy signal seems very high in the 50 to 64 age group, with some tendency toward benefit above 65. I think what we really want to see is head-to-head studies against high-dose and adjuvanted vaccines, including Flublok. Hopefully this is going to be coming soon. That's, I think, part of the special type of approval they got in the over age 65, that they're going to do this clinical trial. mRNA vaccines hurt. I think that's important. People need to keep that in mind, that more injection site reactions, muscle aches, fatigue, malaise, just like with mRNA COVID vaccine. So some people may not want that. And there is a menu of flu vaccines, and people can reasonably choose another one. But the real prize here is having an mRNA licensed flu vaccine, because it gives us a running start on a pandemic avian influenza vaccine when there's already been an FDA approval for a seasonal flu mRNA vaccine. So that really changes the game when it comes to pandemic influenza preparedness. But just remember that RFK Jr. ended HHS mRNA research about a year ago, and Moderna has been pulling back on infectious disease mRNA work because the political terrain is so unpredictable with RFK Jr. in power. There's still hope. Private industry, other countries, they're still working on mRNA vaccines. And there was a really good op-ed in Stat this week by Jeff Kaller from Hopkins talking about the fact that this work is going on despite RFK Jr.'s irrational opposition to it. Pediatric flu vaccination has fallen almost 13 points since the pandemic. Pediatric flu deaths are almost exclusively the province of the unvaccinated child. So what we've seen is COVID vaccine hostility metastasizing into other vaccines. And I can't tell you how much negative energy is coming at me for being an advocate of the mRNA influenza vaccine, even before it's actually in drugstores. I now want to mention a little bit about the Tony Fauci contempt vote. This was a party line referral, and as I said before, this is a scapegoating exercise. As part of this scapegoating, they've released public health information or private health information, which they don't seem to care about. So what happened? Party line committee vote, there's a DOJ referral, there's reported state-level prosecution inquiries in Florida and Alabama. They've been releasing the diaries, they've gotten a hold of his government phone, and just remember in those released diary, there's unredacted private health information, including certain patients' HIV diagnosis. These things were released for their salacious content with no regard to what was medically in them. And I hope those patients actually take action about having their private health information released. And remember, nothing that's happening here is probative. Understanding COVID origins is going to require transparency from the Chinese government about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, other labs there, the early days. There was an op-ed by David Hunter of Oxford making exactly this case. Until the Chinese government is more transparent or we get a defector, we're not going to learn anything more about COVID origins. Nothing done to Fauci is going to substitute for that. IDSA President Ronald Nahaus argued for a 9/11 style commission. And I think that's the only structure that might produce a sober, objective account of origins. This started to happen, but did not really come to fruition. And I think this is where we get to the idea of what policymakers did during the pandemic and how they're scapegoating experts at this point, including Dr. Fauci. And what's happening to Dr. Fauci may have a cost on the infectious disease epidemiology pipeline. We already have a very thin supply of infectious disease physicians. Who's going to step forward during the next emergency if this is what they get met with? Relatedly, Dan Jernigan from the CDC, or former CDC National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Disease, had an op-ed roughly a year after the CDC was shot up. People have sort of forgotten about that. And he argues that nobody trusts the agency now or the accounts it gives. He cited the psychologist Jonathan Haidt. And I don't think that any restoration can come so long as RFK Jr. runs HHS. No matter who the director is, it does not matter if RFK Jr. is running HHS. Lastly, the Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback Aaron Rodgers called Dr. Fauci a coward. Just remember that Fauci cared for AIDS patients before we knew the route of transmission. He's treated Ebola patients personally. That's not what a coward does. I live in Pittsburgh, where there are statues to football players and none to Jonas Salk, so I don't expect much to come of that. I wanted to also talk about the big news in artificial intelligence, where artificial intelligence engineered bacteriophages were able to be constructed and be more efficient than natural phages. And some people are calling this a Wright brothers moment. And there is a major policy question that surrounds this. So let me just give you a little bit on bacteriophages. So for certain drug-resistant bacteria, what people have done is bring back an old technology. And that is viruses that infect bacteria and kill them. That's a cumbersome process. It's happening the natural route. People are doing this. It takes a while. And what's been happening is that AI has been proposed as a way to design better bacteriophages. And these are very simple structures. They're not complex organisms. And what's happened now is that they've been able to engineer phages to go after certain drug-resistant bacteria. The preprint of this paper came out a while ago, and now the official report came out. And there's a major dual-use tension, meaning that the same capability that designs a therapeutic phage, what does it do to the barrier to engineer something dangerous? And policy is playing catch-up with what's happening in AI. This is an important policy discussion that needs to go on, but I think the organizing principle has to be that AI is very, very beneficial to human life. And whatever regulations and restrictions come, they cannot crush the good, because the positive side, including for biodefense, outweighs the negative side by an enormous amount. There already are uses of phages, as I said early, going on clinically. There's a really couple great books about using it for drug-resistant bacteria. And even just in the past week, there was a 3-patient uncontrolled trial using fecal transplants and bacteriophages for recurrent UTI, and it seems to work. It's not proof of concept, but the biological plausibility is there. Imagine being able to do that on the fly with really drug-resistant organisms and have that phage process sped up. That's what the promise is here. There's another AI story I wanted to mention. Genomic sequencing across hospitals is revealing outbreaks that you didn't really see before, just looking at, this person was in bed number 2, this one is in bed number 3, maybe they transmitted it. They're able to get what we call genomic intelligence now. And there is a company called Clarix that's raised a lot of money. And I think this is going to be the future of using genomic sequencing to make hospital-acquired infections easier to track and then prevent. So moving on to some other things that have been in the news, I want to talk a little bit about foodborne disease. So Cyclospora, over 200,000 US cases, 2 deaths reported in Michigan. Now it is a fatal foodborne outbreak. Remember, though, that deaths occur rarely, and they occur in the severely dehydrated and those with underlying condition. There are some reports of recurrence. Maybe the infection didn't clear. Maybe someone consumed that same food again. Maybe they didn't finish the treatment. Maybe they have post-treatment IBS, all things that can happen with Cyclospora. The other point to remember is that this is not one outbreak. It's multiple outbreaks, and there are multiple epidemic curves. It seems that Michigan has everything behind them. They've lifted its bag lettuce advisory, and they believe the Taylor Farms contaminated material is not causing cases there. But other states might be in different scenarios. And remember that the cases may go up for some time. They're going to lag probably 6 weeks because of testing issues. One thing that you can remember is that things you can peel, things that have a skin, less likely to have Cyclospora as we try and understand the other outbreaks. Another point to make is that the CDC division, and I've said this before, that handled Cyclospora is essentially gone. And there was an interesting interview I read about a county nurse asking how a state or a county health department is supposed to knit a multi-state outbreak together. And the honest answer is that it's not. You can't do that without CDC level expertise. And the fact that there's no real Cyclospora division, I think, speaks to that. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post by a Michigan State microbiologist or food microbiologist talking on the way that they're going to start to develop tests to look at the level of Cyclospora contamination in sewage in the United States. I don't know that it will be very big here. This is a tropical, subtropical, endemic parasitic infection. And yes, we get cases related to travelers and related to food, but I don't know how much it's going to be in the sewage. It's a little different than diseases like Cryptosporidium, for example. Just remember, though, that a very small amount of contamination can go a very long way, and that's what's happened with Cyclospora. A few Cyclospora oocysts become millions in a single human. The other big foodborne outbreak to keep in mind is Salmonella. So we have a Salmonella outbreak in jalapenos, 27 states, 345 people infected, 36 hospitalizations, no deaths. And it's been traced to Coast Citrus and linked to Sinaloa, Mexico. Chipotle, Qdoba, Sweet Green, pulling jalapenos. It's Salmonella javiana. The concentration seems to be in Minnesota. There are other Salmonella outbreaks as well. There is one related to eggs at from Midwest Poultry, 98 cases, 17 states, including those involved, including the Kroger grocery store chain. There are 8 outbreaks connected to backyard poultry, 814 people in 44 states. This is ducks and chickens. There's also another outbreak involving veiled chameleons. Remember, reptiles have Salmonella on their bodies all the time. This ended in June, but the pets were brought from different stores, and most of the cases were in children under the age of 3. So another foodborne and waterborne infection is Vibrio vulnificus, which I've mentioned before. The U.S. usually gets 150 to 200 U.S. cases a year. This is concentrated in the Gulf Coast, in Florida. And remember, this is the infection that you get from eating raw oysters or having like an open wound exposed to brackish water. Liver disease is the main risk factor there. So what we've seen now are 5 deaths and 9 cases in Louisiana, 12 cases in Florida, including a fatal case. So this is something that's going to be in the headlines for some time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the microbiome as we get towards the end here. So I've talked about the microbiome, the bacteria, the microorganisms that live in certain niches in your body, including your GI tract, how they may unlock some of the secrets of infectious diseases, autoimmune diseases, and more. A couple of interesting stories. So there is a company making, so C. diff, Clostridium difficile, is the microbiome disease. You get infected with C. diff. C. diff proliferates when your microbiome is disrupted. So some of the treatments for C. diff have involved repopulating your microbiome to make it less conducive to C. diff. That's where fecal transplants came from. So there is a company called Vedanta that's trying to make a C. diff microbiome-based therapy. We do have some microbiome therapies that go beyond fecal transplant as well, but Vedanta is getting more money to push this phase 3 and through phase 3. So there is definitely a market signal that these types of therapies have value. Interestingly, peanut butter allergy or peanut intolerance, fecal bacteria pills can shift the microbiome towards more Bacteroides, which is a species of bacteria, and it seems to modify peanut allergies, which might be better than existing allergen therapies. Not quite ready yet for full clinical use, but an interesting signal with peanut allergy in the microbiome. Probiotics in very low birth weight babies forestalls necrotizing enterocolitis, and they appear safe. They don't cause bloodstream infections, because you worry with necrotizing enterocolitis if what you're giving people in probiotics, if that can leak through the gut and into the bloodstream. It seems to be very, very safe. Necrotizing enterocolitis is a devastating illness in newborns. And HIV. So when you get infected with HIV, there is a lot of immune system tissue in your GI tract. It's called GALT, gut-associated lymphoid tissue. It makes the gut leaky, it gets depleted right away, and then that drives immune activation, even in people who have undetectable viral loads. So there is a microbiome-derived molecule from a bacteria called L. plantarum that may repair that barrier. Really interesting, cool stuff coming out with HIV and the microbiome. And there was an article I read recently about, so I talk all this stuff about microbiome, and then people are going to say, oh, I want to hack my microbiome. Nobody really understands exactly how to do that. We have these signals for clinical diseases, but no one knows what a good microbiome is, what a bad microbiome is. Is your microbiome suited to your life, or is it unsuited to your life? Before you spend a lot of money outside of these clinical trials and the approved products, I think probably kimchi is the cheapest way to do this. And that was what was in an article I read. Spend your money on kimchi rather than trying to hack your microbiome. And then lastly, there was an article in the Associated Press talking about, and I've talked about this a lot, the cascading impact of pandemics, how they changed lots of things in life. And one of them was, when you're interviewing for a job, should you be wearing casual stuff or suits? Because the pandemic made things much more casual. And I think that's really interesting, because pandemics change the way societies operate. They change the way individuals live. And certain trends that are on the cusp of happening might get accelerated by a pandemic, like the death of shopping malls or Zoom or streaming or whatever it might be. Casual versus suits, another one to think about or chalk up to a post-pandemic effect. So to sum up, I think that most of the stories that I'm talking about this week say the same thing. Moderna's flu vaccine, phage engineering, real-time trials, racing an outbreak in the Congo. That's what human beings do when we apply reason to biology. Measles losing elimination, Ebola outbreak, nobody caught for months, a Senate vote that's about punishing a public health official for doing his job. That's what happens when we stop applying reason. The pathogens aren't smarter. The bureaucracy is weaker. That's not a technical problem. It's a decision made by people that we can unmake. What am I watching near term? What happens to that Congo River Ebola rule-out case? What ACIP does with the mRNA flu vaccine, if it even can actually meet, how the DOJ handles a contempt referral that should never have existed, what happens with measles, what happens with our elimination status.